Now, on Authentic, we begin our series on the U.S. Air Force's penultimate Cold War bomber, the B-1. Together with Authentic host Scott Roger Chafian, retired Air Force flight test engineer and author Ken Katz navigates us through the design, development, and combat service of the B-1, from the early days of strategic bombing and nuclear war theory that informed the requirements for its design, through the torturous development, test, and cancellation of the high-altitude Mach 2 B-1A and its metamorphosis into the low-level but still blistering fast B-1B penetrator, evolving into its post-Cold War role as a mainstay of conventional close air support in the War on Terror, and discussion of its role in potential future peer-level conflict. In today's episode, Ken and Roger trace the history of strategic bombing from the dawn of powered flight through the cataclysmic events of World War II and into the early days of the Cold War and the technological developments in bombs, bombers, and missiles that drove the creation of the B-1. The Air Force may call it the Lancer, but to its crews, it's the Supersonic Bone. This is Authentic. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Authentic. I'm your host, Scott Roger Chafian, and with me today is Ken Katz. If you're familiar with the Fighter Pilot podcast and some other podcasts in this space, you're no stranger to Ken. But for those of you who aren't, let me introduce Ken Katz. Ken, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, thanks. It's really enjoyed listening to the podcasts, and it's going to be fun to contribute to them. I'm a career aerospace engineer. I earned an aero and astro degree from MIT back in the dark ages, and I was commissioned through Air Force ROTC, entered active duty in 1985. I was assigned to the Air Force Flight Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base as a flight test engineer, where I was working on B-52 avionics upgrades and cruise missiles. After my military service, I went to work for the Boeing company, where I was a flight test engineer on the V-22 Osprey program. Since then, I've worked in a variety of positions, both in aerospace and in information technology. Currently, I'm a project engineer for one of the major aerospace and defense companies. I lead teams that develop digital flight control systems. I'm also a FAA commercially certified pilot, single-engine, multi-engine, a little less than 1,500 hours with an instrument rating. In addition to my pilot time, I have flight test engineer observer time in about 25 types of military aircraft.
Awesome. So you've seen it from both sides, so to speak. You've got the theory, you've got the practice, and I'm really looking forward to this series with you. And this series is about the B-1 bomber, and we chose Ken because he is the author of a wonderful book called The Supersonic Bone. Ken, can you tell us just a little bit about the book?
The Supersonic Bone is a comprehensive history of the B-1 bomber program. There have been some other books written about the B-1, but most of them are something like 25 or more years old. And the problem is that there simply don't have a lot of the most interesting events in the B-1 history, which includes its combat record. So the Supersonic Bone starts with the origins of the program, really going back to the 1950s, and takes it all the way to the current day. I did a year's worth of research on this project, including visiting Dyess Air Force Base, about 45 interviews, a lot of primary document work. So it's a history that is very comprehensive. It covers politics, it covers defense policy, technology, development, test and evaluation, production, operations, maintenance, combat, modernization, and even up to the retirement of the B-1, which should happen probably about a decade from now. It's got lots of beautiful photographs, many of which have never been published before, and an awful lot of detail. So the feedback's been very positive on the book.
All right. Well, and I'll give you a little bit more of that positive feedback. As a historian, I found it eminently readable, which is very difficult to achieve as an author when you are trying to talk about all the different aspects you described, because you don't miss a beat on any technical aspects, as one would expect you would not as a flight test engineer, but you make it completely understandable and completely readable to a novice, layman, or even journeyman, reader. But you also, as you said, weave in the context of the times, the context of the opposing technology. I think it's an excellent book. And for the listener, oh, absolutely. And for the listener, what we're doing with this series is a little bit different, because you've heard some author debriefs from Authentic, which were individual episodes. And what we're doing now is not a debrief of the book per se, it's a companion piece to the book. So we're going to go through in a number of episodes and talk about the history and development of the B1. And it's going to be a nice parallel to Ken's book. And at the end of the series, I think we'll go ahead and do an author debrief as we did with the others, which will talk about the writing of the book. But this series is really about the B1, or the Supersonic Bone, itself. So with that, let's jump in. And as with most things, you have to look backwards to look forwards. So let's take a look at the history of strategic bombing, which right now, as we record in 2023, is the concept is just over 100 years old. It really began in World War I, right, Ken, with some very nascent and what we would see now as anemic efforts at influencing an enemy population.
Well, let's talk about what we mean by strategic bombing.
Absolutely.
Strategic bombing means bombing the enemy's homeland, directly attacking his economy or the willpower of his citizens or the leadership. That would be in contrast to tactical bombing or other tactical air power, which would be in support of typically air or naval forces. Now, in World War I, the vast majority of air power was tactical air power. It was things like reconnaissance, artillery spotting, trench strafing, and of course what we today would call offensive or defensive counter-air, which is stopping the enemy from doing the same to you, or stopping the enemy from trying to prevent you from doing what you're doing. So, but there was a little bit of strategic air power. For example, the Germans used dirigibles to attack the British homeland. That was actually pretty shocking to the British. The British were used to living behind a English Channel, and since the time of the Spanish Armada, they had felt that they were somewhat isolated from things that happened in Europe. But although it was psychologically a little bit shocking, it actually, the efforts for strategic bombing had no practical impact.
Right.
I mean, except, of course, if a bomb fell on your head, then it did have impact. But
right.
But it had no impact on the course of the war. It was really a novelty.
And in addition to that, there were attempts at heavy bombers on both sides, which are, quite amazing to look at in an era of fabric and wood and wire biplanes. But again, the inability to target efficiently the relatively small bomb loads were not effective in the strategic role. Though, as you said, as with every statistic, if you're the one, it matters.
Right.
So, after World War I and those initial attempts, there was a lot of theory, and this is maybe the golden age or first golden age of air power theory, I would say, in the interwar years. And there were a couple of different philosophies there, right, Ken?
Yeah, well, there's a few things that you need to think about from strategic air power in the period between World War I and World War II. I think in particular there are three things. The first was in World War I, there had been an immense amount, particularly on the Western Front, of trench warfare. And so millions and millions of men, basically a generation of European manhood, had died in these trenches. And people, if there was another war, people wanted to fly over the trenches and directly attack the enemy and avoid these years of static bloodletting. So the first thing was simply, how do we get beyond trench warfare? And of course, the development of tanks was another area of interest with the same basic kind of motivation. The second thing is that 100 years ago, or 90 years ago, aviation was a lot like the internet 25 years ago, or smartphones and social media 15 years ago, or artificial intelligence today. It was the hot technology, and things were happening very rapidly. So in World War I, you have airplanes that are glorified box kites. Really, they
right.
were. They had very, very little capability. But if you look not very much later, you're talking about much better engines, variable pitch propellers, retractable landing gear, aluminum semi-monocoque structures. So you have major increases in range, in speed, and in payload. That was also driving the development of airliners, but it wasn't much different. It was making strategic bombers much, much more capable than they were in World War I. And so the means of doing strategic bombing had advanced far beyond what you saw in the period, say, 1914 to 1918. And third of all, there was an institutional push. If air forces were only going to do tactical missions, then it seemed that they would forever be adjuncts of armies and navies. The more, I would say, extreme or vociferous advocates of air power wanted to have independent air forces that were co-equal with the Army and the Navy, not merely having them as branches of the other forces. Some of these advocates were Billy Mitchell in the United States, Hugh Trenchard in the United Kingdom, and Giulio Douhet in Italy. So strategic missions, and those included strategic bombing of the enemy homeland and coastal defense, had the potential to justify an independent air force that wasn't subordinate to the more traditional services.
Absolutely. And with that sort of fascination that comes with new tech was this idea that the bomber will always get through, right? There is no defense against the strategic bomber. And that led to a lot of different attempts to use the bomber in exactly that way in the Second World War. And we saw, as in the build-up to the Second World War, a couple of different philosophies in the RAF, or the British Royal Air Force, which I believe was the first of the independent air forces, as you said, the first to achieve that. The RAF had a strategic theory, I think, as we would define it, but they still had what would be considered, even by the mid-war years, to be tactical aircraft. They didn't have the range or payload to really achieve deep penetration of targets. And by contrast, the Luftwaffe very much saw their role as that of support to the Army. So they had a much more tactical, or at most operational, theory, and again with tactical aircraft. Would you agree with that, Ken?
I think that's, at the highest level, I think that's largely true, although it's also to some extent a generalization. For example,
Absolutely.
The RAF was using tactical air power for what you could call colonial policing.
Yes.
And the Germans had a variety of bombers which had some strategic capability, although not a full strategic bombing doctrine, but they largely developed these bombers somewhat covertly in the 1930s as essentially, as they said, they were airliners,
Mm-hmm.
but they designed airliners that could very easily be converted to bombers. The idea that the bomber will always get through was not a completely absurd or irrational idea. You know, if you think about a bomber, let's say of the era, going maybe 200 miles an hour, and if something is going 200 miles an hour, you can't see it very far away, and by the time it's come over and dropped a bomb on you and it's gone, and now you scramble, let's say, a fighter to go after it, you probably can't get it. But what that theory neglected is that there was something coming along called radar, and it was a doctrine that made sense if you didn't think about how technology was advancing. So as we'll talk about, the bomber cannot always get through.
Right. And we saw that as World War II dawned, and initially the Germans had great success with the Luftwaffe in what is now known as the Blitzkrieg and the attacks into France and Poland, I should say Poland and France and the Low Countries, and then really came up against that English Channel, which, while a water barrier, enforced the tyranny of distance, if you will, on the Luftwaffe as they attempted to bomb Britain into, or at least the RAF in particular, into submission. And without going into a whole show on the early 1940 Luftwaffe, their fighters didn't have the range to really do combat over the British Isles for an extended amount of time. And they had a bit of a policy that switched gears just as they were becoming effective at hitting one target. And so the Battle of Britain was won by the English, and I shouldn't minimize the heroic efforts of the RAF there. And then the coin is flipped, and the RAF attempts strategic bombing very early on with daylight bombing that is not successful due to attrition, unsustainable attrition, and they turn to night bombing. And that's when the U.S. Army Air Force, the precursor to our U.S. Air Force, upon entry to the war, really picked up the torch of daylight precision strategic bombing. And why don't you take us through what that looked like for the Air Force, Ken?
Well, let's start with the Battle of Britain and the German strategic bombing campaign against Great Britain. The objectives of the German strategic bombing campaign in 1940, which didn't actually end in 1940, but reached their peak in 1940, were first of all to subdue the British, to break their spirit, and second of all, to achieve air superiority over Britain so that they could launch what they called Operation Sea Lion, which would have been the airborne and seaborne invasion of the UK. The Germans were unsuccessful. As you talked about, one of their issues was that they really didn't have the long-range fighters with the ability to achieve air dominance over Britain. But the British also had a whole lot of interesting innovations up their sleeve that greatly impeded the Germans. They included the fact that they had radar, so they could get advanced warning of attacks. The British had an advanced command and control system for fighter aircraft that used the information from the radars, and that was in some ways at least as important as the radars themselves. The British also were capable of doing electronic jamming of German navigation beams. The Germans had these radio means of navigation so they could attack at night with some accuracy, and the British figured out how to jam them. So, and of course, on top of that, the spirit of the British people didn't break. So you put that all together, and the German strategic bombing campaign in 1940 and the years that followed was fundamentally unsuccessful.
Right.
Now, there was, after that, an enormous British and American effort to defeat Germany with strategic bombing. And in the end, that didn't really work either. There were several reasons for that. As you said, the British largely tried to do that at night, and the Americans tried to do that at day. The reasons include the fact that navigation and bomb site technology just wasn't as good as people thought that it was. I mean, it actually was terrible. I've read a description of the early British night bombing attempts where there would be, they would go out after a target and they couldn't get half the bombs within 5 miles of the target. So there would be some random bombs going boom, boom, boom over the German countryside. The Germans couldn't actually figure out what was going on because they just couldn't navigate to the target. And then, so in particular at night, the British couldn't navigate. The problem with the U.S. More precision daylight campaign is that the bomb sites weren't remotely as accurate as people said they were. We had this highly classified device called the Norden bomb sight, and in theory it was really an analog computer tied in with gyroscopes and optics, and quote, you could put a bomb in a pickle barrel. Well, first of all, it wasn't nearly as accurate as it was claimed out to be in the real world, and second of all, there's a lot of clouds in Europe, and an optical bomb sight wasn't from high altitude, didn't work very well when the targets were covered in clouds. So the first thing is that just navigation and bombing technology wasn't remotely up to the task. The second thing was that the bombers didn't get through because the Germans had very effective air defenses. Again, their radars, fighter control system, various day and night fighters, anti-aircraft artillery. The Germans were inflicted enormous losses on the British and the Americans. Mm-hmm. And then, like the British, the Germans also didn't collapse when they were hit by bombs. They just sort of stuck it out. So if the overall premise of the strategic bombing campaign against Germany was that we're going to win the war in the air, it didn't work. In the end, Germany was conquered the old-fashioned way. Now, air power, of course, played a key role in that in a more tactical sense. But the strategic campaign per se was not the thing that defeated Germany. However, it wasn't a total failure. Particularly towards the end of the war, American air power during the day largely ground the Luftwaffe to bits. That didn't win the war, but what it did was enable the invasion across the channel. There was a highly successful campaign against German oil and petroleum supplies, and that was sort of, they had always been looking for the target that would paralyze the Germans, and they tried going after ball bearings and aircraft production. None of those really worked. Going against oil actually did work pretty well, and in the end, the Germans didn't run out of tanks and they didn't run out of airplanes in the war. They ran out of fuel to operate those things. They had plenty of tanks and plenty of airplanes even at the end of the war, but they just didn't have fuel. So the oil campaign, while it didn't decisively defeat Germany in and of itself, certainly had a major effect. The other thing is that the night bombing campaign by the British, which was an area campaign, essentially it was let's burn their cities to the ground. As the war went on, the British got better. They got better bombers, they got better bombs, they got better navigation systems, better tactics, better airborne radar, better electronic countermeasures, and they more or less started burning Germany to the ground end to end. That wasn't decisive, but it certainly didn't do the Germans any good. After the war, there was a U.S. strategic bombing survey of this. They wanted to understand how effective was this air campaign, and they fairly conclusively proved that the air campaign, contrary to the advocates of air power, was not decisive in the war against Germany. However, I'm going to be a little bit of a revisionist there. Okay. I think that the strategic bombing campaign was a bit more successful. It obviously wasn't decisive. It didn't defeat Germany. But I think it was more decisive or at least more successful at the strategic level than perhaps the strategic bombing survey said. And I have several reasons for saying that. First of all, the strategic bombing campaign was effectively a second front against the Germans when, other than that, the Germans were involved in fighting the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front, which is where the majority of their military went. And, of course, they were fighting the Allies, in the Mediterranean and North Africa and Italy, which was very much a secondary effort. But the strategic bombing campaign was people think that the war in Northwest Europe started, on June 6, 1944 with the invasion in Normandy. But one can argue that front was already going. It was called the Strategic Bombing Campaign. And think about how much resources, meaning things like manpower, materials, fuel, industrial capability, had to be diverted particularly from the Eastern Front in order to defend Germany itself against the air campaign. If those resources had been able to be devoted against the Soviet Union, I think that the Eastern Front might have been a very different story. So at that level, I think that the strategic bombing campaign, while very expensive to the Allies, was also a valuable second front that diverted an enormous amount of German resources. And the United States and Britain could afford that. In the end, Germany couldn't.
Right.
I think there's another even more indirect value to the campaign. The German home front was devastated by this bombing campaign. I mean, cities were burned out. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed by this. And what the strategic bombing campaign did was drive home to the German people in a very direct, brutal, and violent way that they were defeated and that Nazism had been a disaster, had brought catastrophe to Germany. So there was no stab-in-the-back propaganda like there was after World War I and people saying, oh, now let's really, now if we only get rid of the Jews or whatever, we can go back and win the second time around. This time, Germany on the home front was so smashed and shattered and burned out that the Germans said, we'll try a new way. And of course, Germany, or at least the western half of Germany, became a peaceful and democratic country. So in that way, I think that the strategic bombing campaign had a strategic effect in that it won the peace after the war.
I could not agree with you more, actually. And in addition to everything you said, there are second, third, fourth order ripple effects to everything you mentioned, such as the lack of oil means not only a lack of air power, it means a lack of operational and tactical mobility for both ground and air forces. It meant a reduction of pilot training, which meant that, much as we saw in the Pacific with the Japanese, by the end of the war, relatively untrained novices are taking the air against probably the most highly trained and experienced combat pilots in terms of hours and years of combat the world had seen to date and maybe even has seen now. So I completely agree, and I think you're absolutely right about the effect it had on post-war. Interesting note that as bad as it was, because you're right, we devastated Germany, that the Germans were still defending in the east to allow their civilians a chance to flow west, because as bad as that was, they saw it as preferable to what was going to happen when the Russians overran their ground. But also to your point of basically firing the German countryside, it was very unpopular in the first 4 or 5 years after the war to admit you were part of Bomber Command. In the RAF, it was seen almost as something immoral. There were quite a few bomber crew members that said, oh, no, I'd been part of Fighter Command. And I'm not criticizing Bomber Command at all. They did the job they had to do. But it's just interesting to see how, looking back when you're not in the heat of the moment, things can change. But I think all of that speaks to then the post-war environment. Of course, the post-war environment was greatly affected by some of the last aerial delivered weapons of the war, correct?
Absolutely, but let's just talk a little bit more about the impact of the fuel shortage before I go on to the next thing.
Absolutely.
People think of the Germans in terms of panzers and things like that, but what people actually don't realize is that, yes, the Germans had some armored forces, but the German army in World War II was primarily a horse-drawn army. The armored forces were the exception, and that even increased, even though people think at the end of the war, the Germans had marvelous Panther tanks and Tiger tanks and things like that. Yeah, but they couldn't fuel them, and so they had a lot of horses. In contrast to the U.S. Army, which had more horses than tanks in 1940, and by 1945, of course, was a fully mechanized army. Even foot infantry divisions were in reality heavily mechanized. Another thing is that you mentioned pilot training in passing, but the Germans entered World War II with very well-trained pilots, many of whom had developed their skills in the German intervention in the Spanish Civil War, and it was a huge source of advantage for them. By the end of the war, their pilots were largely kids who mostly learned to fly with gliders, and then they stuck them in an airplane like a Messerschmitt Bf-109. Now, a Bf-109 in the hands of an experienced, well-trained pilot is a very, very capable airplane. And in the hands of a kid who maybe had a few glider flights and then a few power flights and then in a 109, these kids were cracking up on takeoff and landing. Forget getting shot down. They couldn't safely get off the ground or back on the ground. And the German air power at the end just collapsed. They didn't have pilots who could take advantage of the airplanes that existed because they were untrained, let alone that they didn't really have fuel for the airplanes anyway. So yes, there were those higher order effects. But as you were starting to go, there was another strategic bombing campaign halfway around the world, and that was really the one that in some ways set the pattern for the future, because in the Pacific and in Asia, you had the challenge of very long distances, much longer than what you had in Europe. And so ultimately, a strategic bombing campaign required a whole new generation of bombers. That airplane was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Now, at first, the American strategic bombing campaign against Japan was very unsuccessful. There were a couple reasons for that. The B-29 was a new generation of technology. It was rushed into service. It was a hugely expensive program. It was like $3 billion, which was like 50% more than the Manhattan Project.
Right.
And that's when $3 billion was real money, not pocket change like today.
Right.
And it had a whole bunch of problems, including the disturbing tendency of its engines to catch on fire. So one thing was that the airplane wasn't quite ready for prime time. The other problem is that it was being operated from bases in China, and the logistics difficulties of operating from bases in China was just enormous. Every B-29 sortie required multiple sorties of supply flights over the hump from India to China to supply that flight. So you had to ship supplies halfway around the world to India, multiple flights to get it over the hump from India to China. Then you'd get one sortie out of a B-29, and it just, logistically, it was a non-starter. And on top of that, you were getting highly inaccurate bombing. They were trying to do high-altitude precision bombing with the B-29, and they were running into something called the jet stream. They had no idea what the jet stream was. They had never been flying at those altitudes before. And the bombs were not getting anywhere near the target. So it was time for a major change. The U.S. Army Air Forces had committed to the B-29 in a big way, and things did change. After the capture of the Marianas Islands, the B-29 force moved to the Marianas Islands in the Pacific from China, and then additional bombardment wings came over directly to the Marianas. So it was much easier to supply air bases in the Marianas Islands than in China. They also switched from high-altitude bombing to low-altitude bombing, primarily at night and using incendiaries, basically napalm. These attacks started in 1945, and frankly, it was horrific. Every mission was burning down another Japanese city. They were killing hundreds of thousands of people, and then the bombing got even more effective after Iwo Jima was captured, because now you not only had a base to recover. The B-29 still had engine problems, but and B-29s with some regularity were landing in the Pacific. You certainly lost the airplane. In some cases, you lost the crew. They tried to do air-sea rescue in a pretty serious way, but still, they were taking some losses. Now that you had Iwo Jima about halfway between the Marianas and mainland, or the main islands of Japan, you had a base that you could put down damaged B-29s. Also, they started flying what they called VLR, or very long-range fighter escort, out of Iwo Jima. They had P-51D Mustangs, and towards the very end of the war, they got some P-47N, which were the long-range version of the Thunderbolts. And now the airplanes had fighter escort. So you had a horrendously effective bombing campaign against against Japan. In addition to the bombing campaign, what people forget about, there was also an aerial mining campaign. So Japan's an island. It's not a particularly resource-rich island, and the bombers were dropping mines, which basically cut off a lot of the sea commerce to Japan. And that was reinforcing the effects of the U.S. Navy's highly effective submarine campaign. So by the summer of 1945, Japan was being literally starved to death and burned out end to end. And then, of course, in August 1945, B-29s based in the Marianas Islands dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan. Now, those were the only 2 nuclear weapons we had, but the Japanese didn't know that. And, the whatever horrors we had been inflicting on them, now it looked like the horrors were going to go up by orders of magnitude. And although there were certainly strong elements in Japan that wanted to fight to the very end, the emperor said that's enough and decided to surrender. So in Japan, you see that strategic bombing had finally achieved what the theoreticians and advocates had been saying for, at that point, 20 plus years, which is that you actually can defeat an enemy through bombing and you don't need to invade the homeland. Mm-hmm. So the bombing campaign against Japan really set the pattern for strategic bombing in the future.
Yeah, and as we talk about this, there's a lot of moral debate over the atomic bombs. That's not what we're here for. We're reporting the history. But it's important to understand that was the history, both of, as you said, the immolation of Japanese cities, first with conventional incendiary bombing and then with the 2 nuclear bombs. And that, as you said, set the tone as we moved into the post-war world.
Indeed. Now, it had been hoped that World War II was truly the war to end all wars. And now we would have the United Nations and we would have some basis for future peace. Alas, that wasn't what happened, because you had communist insurgency in Greece in 1947. You had the Berlin blockade in 1948. In 1949, the communists emerged victorious in the Chinese Civil War. And then in 1950, you had the North Korean invasion of South Korea. So it was very clear that we had gone in a very few years from a global existential combat between the Axis and the Allies to a global existential combat between the Soviet Union and its communist bloc against the United States and its allies.
And the stakes are much higher now.
They were, because meanwhile, in the United States, you had a couple of organizational things that would become very important. In 1946, the Army Air Forces formed something called the Strategic Air Command, or we'll call it SAC. And that was if you will, an organizational embodiment of the concept of strategic bombing. And in 1947, you had an independent U.S. Air Force that was formed by splitting off from the U.S. Army. So the organizational construct for strategic bombing through the entire Cold War was in place by the 1940s, at the same time that the Cold War was spinning up. And of course, in places like Korea, it wasn't a Cold War at all. It was a very hot war, but it wasn't a global general war. It was very much a restricted local war.
And now, the almost always by proxy.
Yes. The motto of the Strategic Air Command was "Peace is our profession," and that sounds a little bit goofy, but it actually made sense. We really didn't want to fight a nuclear war. So the idea was that if Strategic Air Command was sufficiently threatening, it would deter war. And that was both a combination of capability and very high readiness. Basically, as the 1950s rolled on, Strategic Air Command was put on a permanent wartime footing. It was ready to go with a very short warning, 24/7, 365. There was Pearl Harbor was a recent memory, and the ultimate nightmare was a nuclear Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack that would disarm us, and that would be the starting blow of a new world war. So you're not going to have a nuclear Pearl Harbor if you're ready to go on very short notice, and that was the basic concept.
Yeah, let me step in for a minute there, because I think we need to draw some parallels just to set the tenor for the rest of the Cold War discussion, which is Pearl Harbor to a current generation is some pages in a history book, if you're not a historian. But to the point you just made, the sneak attack, which all sorts of political theory and everything else, but without a declaration of war, that was such an emotional blow, created an almost DNA encoded fear of something the same happening again. And, as an anti-terrorism guy myself, for a current generation, if you remember back to 9/11, after those attacks, we had a national fear of another terrorist attack. And there's a lot of discussion there about what we did and what could have been done. But I want everyone to remember, as we talk about this fear of a Soviet sneak attack, don't think of it as the Pearl Harbor mindset. Put yourself into the way people felt for at least the first 5 or 6, if not 10 years after 9/11, that it probably wasn't if, it was when. They're going to do it. They're going to try again. We better be ready. And that is the national feeling that goes into the development of the systems, the architecture, and the strategies we had. So sorry to interrupt you there, but I wanted to put everyone into that mindset.
No, I completely agree with you. And as a historian of sorts, I have a very strong belief that when you analyze history and write about it, you need to understand history in terms of what people at the time knew and what they were thinking, not what we do in hindsight. So in my book, I try to analyze decisions in that way. What were people thinking at the time with what they knew? And that's a much more valuable thing than looking back in hindsight and saying, "Oh, they
Absolutely.
were dummies," or they were overly worried about something, or whatever else. They made decisions based on what they knew and thought at the time. So I completely agree with you. And the fear of a nuclear Pearl Harbor, when there had been the actual Pearl Harbor in the not too recent past, and now as of 1949, the Soviets had nuclear weapons too. Mm-hmm. So this was a real fear. Now, in this Cold War period, strategic air power was very attractive to the United States for 3 reasons. The first is that it was American. It was an American strength. We had technological superiority in both air power and nuclear weapons, and a good strategy typically exploits your strengths and the enemy's weaknesses. Well, this was our strength. The second advantage was that in a country like the United States, which is very wealthy in terms of money and capability, and people are expensive, although it was hugely expensive to build a fleet of bombers and nuclear weapons, it was actually less expensive than to field the kind of enormous conventional army that we would need to stop the Soviets and their allies if we tried to do it the old-fashioned way. So it was paradoxically very expensive, but less expensive than the alternative. And the third thing is that the Korean War is one of those events that I think that people, it's now called in some cases the Forgotten War, and people don't think about it, but the Korean War was actually very, very influential during a period. For one thing, you can't understand American decisions pertaining to the early years of the Vietnam War without understanding the Korean War. But what people forget is that the Korean War, which is now regarded more or less as a success in hindsight, I mean, after all, we kept South Korea free, and South Korea is now a incredibly successful and prosperous and democratic country. In the 1950s, the Korean War was regarded as kind of a bloody, grinding mess, and we didn't want to have another Korean War. So we had a new doctrine called massive retaliation. And massive retaliation basically said we're not going to match the Soviets, Soviet bloc man for man, and we're not going to fight more grinding wars in distant places. We're going to exploit our superiority in strategic air power, and ideally we would do that. That strategic air power would deter the Soviet Union. But if war broke out, conventional forces were basically going to be tripwires, and then we were going to wipe the Soviet Union and its allies off the face of the earth. Like, not figuratively wipe them off the earth, but literally wipe them off the face of the earth. And that was the theory of massive retaliation. Now, in hindsight, we know that that had some success. After all, it prevented the outbreak of a general war. Of course, the problem is that the Soviets, in reality, we weren't going to obliterate the Soviet Union for everything. So the Soviets instead and their allies kind of nibbled around the edges. And you had insurgencies in places like Vietnam where we weren't going to use nuclear weapons. Of course, the Soviet Union also developed increasing nuclear forces, so to some extent they deterred massive retaliation. But in the 1950s, massive retaliation was American stated policy. And there were real effects in our defense establishment. If you look at, say, the U.S. military before the implementation of massive retaliation, you had roughly equal-sized slices that went to the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, and I'll lump in the Marines with the Navy.
Yeah.
And if you look at the United States today, you have roughly the same thing. I think the Navy budget may be slightly higher, but it's roughly a third. And again, I'm lumping in the Marines with the Navy and the Space Force with the Air Force. But in the 1950s, you had a very different picture. I mean, the Air Force was getting a hugely oversized portion of the budget, and within the Air Force, it was largely Strategic Air Command. So the American military at the heyday of this massive retaliation doctrine was basically, bluntly, the Strategic Air Command and then the cats and dogs around the edges. It was a very, in some ways, unbalanced force because that's what the massive retaliation policy drove it to.
If you don't mind me breaking in for a minute, just to, again, set the listener's mindset. So as a teenager growing up in California in the 1980s, speaking for myself, there was this feeling of there is no such thing as a winnable nuclear war. And I think on the global level, the Soviet Union, the United States, by the 1980s, that was probably almost certainly a true statement. But for the listener thinking about these policy developments in the late 40s and early 1950s, the technology of the bombers being used, the technology of the nuclear weapons being used, the numbers of weapons being used, it was not going to be global Armageddon in the way we think about it right now with hundreds or thousands of ICBMs, SLBMs. We really sort of eased ourselves into that point. So I want the listener to remember that this was not, as is sometimes characterized, the military just advocating the end of the human race. This was a very viable theory, at least, that we could get the most value for the American taxpayer's dollar while keeping the American taxpayer safe by simply threatening this massive retaliation. It wasn't going to be end of the world at that point.
Well, that transformed over the course. If you look at, say, let's say the early to mid 1950s, if we had fought a nuclear war against the Soviet Union in that era, let's say that the Korean War, what we feared at the time, which is that the Korean War was essentially a prelude to to World War III. If we had gone to war against the Soviet Union in 1953, it would have been like World War II in a day. It would have been a horrible, but not world-ending, cataclysmic kind of attack. That actually changed as the 50s went on. I mean, we got much better bombers, and we got much bigger bombs. They weren't these nuclear kind of bombs of the sort that took out Hiroshima and Nagasaki and slightly improved derivatives of them. I mean, we got thermonuclear bombs that were orders of magnitude more powerful, and we got lots of them. And I would say that by the late 1950s, in fact, not only would we have had a cataclysmic nuclear war, I mean, it would have in one day been far worse than World War II on steroids. But what we didn't appreciate at the time was that there would have been massive amounts of radioactive stuff that would have circled at least the northern hemisphere in particular, and we probably would have induced massive climate change also because of all the stuff that we kicked up in the air. And I actually think that by the late 1950s, if we had fought an all-out war with the Soviet Union, it could have been pretty close to an apocalyptic end of life as we know it event. Not just World War II in a day, but the end.
The end.
And we really didn't appreciate that at the time. The analysis of effects took into account prompt effects. So essentially they were treating thermonuclear weapons as big, high explosive devices. But they really had no inkling of the global fallout issues, and they certainly had no idea about potential climate type effects. And it would have been the end, most likely. Thank God we will never run that. We've never run that experiment to date.
Absolutely.
I hope we continue to never run it.
Right. And so, yeah, that's good information. I had thought we got to that point sometime in the mid to late 60s. So you were definitely the expert on this. So interesting to hear that even by the late 50s, we had reached that weapon saturation.
Yeah. I mean, by the late 1950s, we had the ability to deliver thousands of thermonuclear weapons to the Soviet Union. And other countries in the Soviet bloc, not to mention all the tactical nuclear weapons and what have you.
Right.
Let's talk about a very important event that happened in 1957. In this era of massive retaliation and a dependence on strategic air power, the United States was patting itself on the back that, essentially we were superior to the Soviet Union because this played to our strengths in terms of industrial capability and technological innovation. And then in 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1. And not only was there this red moon that was going over the United States, but it was fairly clear that if you could put a satellite in orbit, you could put a thermonuclear warhead on a target. Anywhere in the world. Of course, Sputnik 1 was launched by an R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile fundamentally. And so America all of a sudden was terrified. We had lost our edge. The Soviets had what appeared to be a superior missile program. And there was a real question, had we fallen behind? Were bombers yesterday's news? It looked like, and of course the United States did have very aggressive missile programs going on at this time, but it appeared that we were behind. Whether we actually were or weren't, in hindsight, probably less so than we thought, but the perception was certainly there. And more broadly, it wasn't clear that bombers were relevant in the future for strategic missions. Maybe we were in the age of missiles and the bombers were yesterday's news. There were a lot of people who thought that. So, to an outfit like the Strategic Air Command, which was built around bombers, of course, going back to the heritage of World War II, this was a real threat because institutions have self-images, and their images was not of we fly bombers, not exclusively. They weren't opposed to missiles, but the idea that bombers might be obsolete and the future Strategic Air Command would be sitting in a silo in the Midwest ready to launch a missile wasn't quite what their organizational conception was.
Right.
Missiles also changed things in another way because now, previously, strategic deterrence had been largely an Air Force mission. The Navy had piddled around with it a little bit with some Regulus missiles launched by submarines, a little bit of using aircraft carriers, but basically that battle had been fought and lost in the late 1940s, and strategic deterrence was largely an Air Force mission. But now you had the possibility of launching nuclear-armed Polaris missiles from nuclear submarines, and the Navy said we could get into this game too. So you had, if you will, three major choices. There were also some other ideas like intercontinental cruise missiles, but those didn't really pan out. You had three basic weapon systems that were, if you will, competing for the future. We had intercontinental ballistic missiles, land-based missiles that could launch from the continental United States and hit the Soviet Union. You had sea-launched ballistic missiles, which would to say shorter-range missiles, but they would be launched from U.S. Navy nuclear submarines and carry nuclear weapons into the Soviet Union. And then, of course, you had strategic bombers. the old standby. And there were advocates for each of those. The question was, what should we do? Do we only need one? Do we need all three? And a doctrine evolved called the triad. And the triad said that each of these options has its advantages and disadvantages, and the advantages and disadvantages of each kind of cover the advantages of one kind of cover up for the deficiencies of the others. And therefore, we're going to have a triad, tri meaning three, with three legs. We're going to do both bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles and sea-launched ballistic missiles, and that's what we're going to do in the future. Now, let's be blunt. This was very expensive. But, when you're trying to deter nuclear war, you can justify an awful lot of money. And from an institutional point of view, it gave everybody a piece of the action. So it let the Navy get a piece of the strategic pie, and it kept the Strategic Air Command and bombers. So the only people who really got hurt were the taxpayers. And as I said, having some degree of redundancy to avoid nuclear war, while an extravagance, isn't necessarily an irresponsible extravagance.
Right.
So here's how the triad works out. Let's take the legs one by one. You have intercontinental ballistic missiles. What are the advantage of land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles? Well, you got 90% of your force or more is on alert at any one time. You don't have airplanes that are sitting on the ground not ready to go. You don't have submarines in port not ready to go. Pretty much all your missiles, except for the few that are in maintenance at any one time, are ready to go. You have very secure command, control, and communications. You're going from command centers to fixed sites. And you also have invulnerability to air defenses. A fighter interceptor or a surface-to-air missile is not going to shoot down an intercontinental ballistic missile reentry vehicle coming in at Mach 10 or whatever. So in that way, intercontinental ballistic missiles were great. Now, you had a couple of downsides of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which is that whenever you have fixed facilities, you have a certain vulnerability. Perhaps, remember back to the fear of a nuclear Pearl Harbor. So if your missiles are just sitting there, that's potentially, if the enemy can attack them accurately enough, you could have another nuclear Pearl Harbor. As we said, Strategic Air Command didn't want to be just silo sitters. And these missiles used, they didn't actually find a target. They flew to a set of coordinates. And that meant they had to use inertial navigation, and the accuracy is dependent on extremely accurate geodesy, which is to say measuring the Earth, and extremely accurate gravimetry, which is to say having a highly accurate mathematical model of the gravity of the Earth. And those things really were just developing at the time. We know the effects of gravity when you shoot a missile out of, say, Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is the ICBM test base in California, and you shot that out towards Kwajalein, which is the island that we use to target. We know to super high detail the effects of gravity. And similarly, if you shot something out of Cape Canaveral to the east, we had the same thing. We've never shot missiles towards the Soviet Union.
Right.
Obviously now with satellites and everything, we've mapped that gravity extremely closely. But at the time, we didn't. And so these missiles that in theory were highly accurate, probably in reality, because of limitations on geodesy and gravimetry, were not as accurate as we thought. And you didn't have a human being on board, a navigator, who could actually adjust. So again, pluses and minuses. Now let's go to sea-launched ballistic missiles. The great advantage of sea-launched ballistic missiles is that you can't preemptively attack them. They're on submarines. The submarines are mobile. The submarines are essentially hidden. You're not going to have a nuclear Pearl Harbor. And so the Navy at the time, or at least some people in the Navy, were arguing, hey, we have an invulnerable deterrent force. We don't need, once we have Polaris missile submarines, we can shut down Strategic Air Command. Needless to say, Strategic Air Command was less than enthusiastic with that idea. But, of course, sea-launched ballistic missiles were also invulnerable to air defenses. So it sounds like what you have is the perfect weapon, but not so fast. Every inaccuracy that you had with intercontinental ballistic missiles, pertaining to limitations on inertial navigation, geodesy, gravimetry, not only were those present with sea-launched ballistic missiles, but whereas an intercontinental ballistic missile was launched from a known surveyed location, a sea-launched ballistic missile was being launched from a moving submarine. And yes, the submarines got great inertial navigation systems, and yes, we developed satellite navigation, which essentially was the distant precursor of global positioning system, so that we could know where the submarines were. But nonetheless, it wasn't nearly as accurate as launching them from a surveyed site. Exactly. And so the sea-launched ballistic missiles were fairly inaccurate, particularly in the early days. Now, you would think that, if a missile carrying a nuclear warhead misses by a few miles, that's no big deal. But it is a big deal. There are a lot of targets where missing by a few miles, obviously against a city, that's less relevant. But against a lot of other targets, missing by a few miles actually is very relevant.
Hardened silos, for example.
Yeah, another thing is that the communications with submarines is pretty tenuous. And whereas a land-based force, you get the word out and they're going to launch, you get the word out to a submarine, it might or might not get out, particularly if there's all kinds of wild things going on in the middle of a nuclear war. So you had what looked at first blush like the ultimate strategic weapon system, and then when you looked at things like accuracy and communications, the submarines had their problem. And now we get to the old standby, bombers. Now, bombers have a couple of great attributes. They can do very accurate weapons delivery. And we're now looking at the world in, say, 1960. And the reason why they have it is because whereas missiles basically just launch to a coordinate, we talked about all the issues of accuracy in the real world pertaining to launching to a coordinate. Bombers would have a radar and they would have a navigator on board, and they could actually navigate to a target. They could say, okay, this target is 20 miles at a bearing of 250 from this bend in the river. And they could actually compensate for deficiencies in maps and what have you. Mm-hmm. So they were the most accurate way to deliver a warhead. Bombers carried a much bigger payload than missiles did. So you carried more bombs and bigger bombs. When you launched a ballistic missile, there was no way to recall it. You light the candle and it's gone. So you're irreversibly committed to nuclear war when you shoot a missile. Now with bombers, that's not the case. You can launch them on warning. You can say, either a crisis is happening or we just picked up something on radar. Now, it would be a real bummer to start World War III because we picked up something on radar and it turned out that it was some sort of atmospheric anomaly or a flock of geese. Yeah. So pretty much you didn't want to launch your missiles till you started having explosions on the homeland, which would be definitive proof that you were under attack. You could launch a bomber and you just would have it fly out to a go-no-go point. And the standing orders were fly out to the go-no-go point, and if you don't get word, come on back, or we'll give you a word that war's underway and continue past. That recallability and launch on warning was a very valuable thing that only bombers had because, of course, they had people on board. Right. Another thing is that missiles you really can't test every day. You launch a missile and it's gone, and plus missiles, setting up for example, we've never launched a intercontinental ballistic missile out of an operational silo. Never. We've only launched them out of Vandenberg and out of Cape Canaveral. So there's a question, does this stuff really work? Yeah. Whereas with a bomber, you can fly a bomber every day. And no, you're not going to drop an actual nuclear weapon. You can drop a simulated nuclear weapon. I don't mean just like, something that's a figment of electrons. You can actually drop a thing off the airplane. Mm-hmm. And it can have the arming system of an actual nuclear bomb. It just doesn't have the, it doesn't go bang. Right. It doesn't have the nuclear component. So you can verify the reliability of every element of a nuclear bomber except for the thing that goes bang. And of course we were also conducting underground nuclear tests, so that's how we could verify the bang every day. And so in some ways you had much more confidence in the reliability of bombers than you did of either intercontinental or sea-launched ballistic missiles. So now, bombers, of course, have their own problems. One of the problems of bombers is that only 30% of the force is routinely on alert. So you have to buy 10 bombers to put 3 on, to have 3 that are ready to go at any time, as opposed to intercontinental ballistic missiles where you buy 10 missiles and let's say 9 or 10 of them are on alert at any one time. Submarines, of course, it's less so because they're in port. At least sometimes.
The math is about the same there as it is for the bombers, right? We generally consider 3 to keep 1 at sea.
Right. But whereas so you had that, and then of course you can shoot down a bomber in a way that in 1970 you could, or excuse me, 1960 or 1970 you really couldn't shoot down a ballistic missile. So if you look at all the pros and cons, you have this triad that frankly was put in for some institutional reasons and political reasons, but actually there was a great logic to it. It wasn't yes, you can be cynical about these things, but there was real logic behind it, that each of these legs of the triad had advantages and disadvantages. You put them all together and you'd have to be insane to attack the United States with nuclear weapons. And in fact, it worked. We, of course, had the most serious crisis we've ever had in the nuclear age, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And in fact, if you look at the real world, I know in war games, things would turn into nuclear war pretty rapidly. You look at the real world of how people operated and made decisions in 1962. Now, Fidel Castro was all hot and bothered to start a nuclear war, but he was a fanatic, and the Khrushchev did not think very highly of this young fanatic. Khrushchev was not a nice person, but he also wasn't insane and did not want to fight a nuclear war. And certainly John F. Kennedy didn't want to fight a nuclear war. And, the triad worked. We didn't have a nuclear war. And, of course, we never had one throughout the entire Cold War, which I think is the greatest feat of American military power in American history.
Right. It was literally the winning of the peace.
Yes.
By avoiding war. Quick side note question. The lack of a test of an ICBM from an operational silo, was that an operational security issue? Or was it a world safety issue? By operational security, you don't want to completely give the exact location of a given silo away, though I think at some point when satellites become de rigueur that the Soviets figure it out. So my guess, it was more of you don't want to launch anything ever that might look like it's the real thing.
I don't think it was that so much, because you could, of course, always tell the Soviets, we're going to launch a missile out of this silo in Missouri, heads up, and you're going to see that we're going to put it on a trajectory that is anywhere towards you. I don't think it was that. I think it was the fact that, yes, these silos are in the Midwest and West, and to some extent in the early days, the South, but they're human beings that are around these things, and these missiles fly over people, and you can't just have missiles dropping stages and potentially blowing up and whatnot. Forget the nuclear warhead. I mean, obviously you're not going to put a nuclear warhead, but just the missiles themselves. I mean, you can think, oh yeah, this missile's in North Dakota in the middle of nowhere. Well, it's the middle of nowhere, but there is a farmer who lives 2 miles away from this silo. And what are you going to do? Launch a missile over his house?
I had thought about that. Excellent point.
I mean, it's really just too dangerous to do it, which is why, of course, you only launch them out of coastal bases.
Okay. Right, because in the real thing, that one missile's the least of that farmer's problems.
The least of the problems. But, in peacetime, you can't go launching, at least in the United States, you can't go launching missiles, over people's houses.
Right.
Even in rural North Dakota or
Even
someplace, out in the desert in Arizona where we had Titan IIs, you just can't do that stuff.
All right, fair enough. All right, so sorry for the derail.
No, it's a perfectly good question.
All right, so we've got the triad, and the triad works. It makes it insanity to try and attack the U.S. because you're not going to get all of our deterrent forces. It greatly exacerbates the Soviets' problem in any attempt at defense or mitigation. And what that means is now the U.S. is in a place where we need to look at future bomber designs.
Well, let me just, before we go into that, let me
Mm-hmm.
introduce the greatest acronym of all time. And of course, we're in a business where there are lots of acronyms, but the greatest acronym of all time is called MAD, which stood for Mutually Assured Destruction. And what that meant was that no superpower was going to start a nuclear war, because if they did, they were going to get obliterated. And yes, that's insane. It's mad, but hey, it kept the peace.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's the analogy of living for 50 years with a gun pointed at one another's head, which is not a great way to live. And on the other hand, is it better to live where you both have your gun in your holster and you're wondering if the other guy's going to try a quick draw and will you be up to the challenge? I mean, there's no good answer.
Right. Although if you have a gun pointed at each other's heads, that gives you an incentive to pull the trigger first. Whereas if you have a gun pointed at each other's heads and you know that the bullet's going to do a U-turn and hit you in the head, or if the enemy dies, then his gun will shoot anyway. That's almost more of an analogy.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
So now we get to the aircraft that are the bomber leg of the triad.
The triad.
And in World War II, of course, you needed a mass, hundreds or 1,000 bombers. And, as we said, by the end of the war, you could burn down a city by doing that. With nuclear weapons, one bomber dropping one bomb could do the same effect. So you move away from mass bomber raids. The first nuclear bomber that we had was the B-29, and the version that was modified for nuclear weapons was called Silverplate. So we had Silverplate bombers. Of course, we had some of them in World War II, and then we built several more batches of them. And Silverplate B-29s were used into either the late 40s or early 50s. Of course, we had lots of B-29s that were not Silverplate modified, and those were used during the Korean War, for example. But those were not Silverplate airplanes. The Silverplate airplanes were rather carefully husbanded for nuclear missions. And then we got a better version of the B-29. It was originally called the B-29D. And instead of having these problematic R-3350 engines, it had the big Pratt & Whitney R-4360s, which were more powerful, more reliable. And originally, as I said, it was designated the B-29D, but Congress said, no, hang on now. We're talking about the late 1940s. We just built thousands of B-29s, and now we filled the desert with them, and you want us to buy more B-29s? And the Air Force said, did we call that the B-29D? Oh, that was a mistake. It's the B-50. Yes, we want to buy lots of B-50s. So they built a bunch of B-50s, which were basically better B-29s, and those became the mainstay of our nuclear bomber force in the late 40s, early 50s. And it's also important, while not directly bombers, it's critical to bring up their teammates, because at the same time you're deploying nuclear weapons. And we didn't have very many nuclear weapons actually in the late 1940s, but once the Korean War started, we really started building a lot of them. And what they basically were high-volume production versions of what we dropped on Nagasaki. We had, if you will, the big three of technology that was happening. You had nuclear weapons, of course. You had jet engines, and we'll talk about the impact of those in a minute. And you had the third, which is aerial refueling. Because now you had to be able to fly these airplanes at much longer range. And so the first tankers that we had were KB-29s. They were modified B-29 bombers that had air refueling apparatus. And so in 1949, a B-50 flew around the world non-stop, refueled, of course, by multiple B-29 KB-29 sorties. But now you had a demonstration that Strategic Air Command had a truly global reach. That was a big deal. And then the Air Force got its first dedicated tanker, which was the Boeing KC-97. The KC-97 was very much a B-50 bomber with a new fuselage, and the new fuselage had fuel tanks in it and a air refueling boom. So it was a optimized, purpose-built tanker, not a modified bomber. And so you really, if you're going to understand the aircraft of the period, the tankers are as important as the bombers are.
Right, because you physically cannot achieve this strategic nuclear bombing mission without the tankers, right? Because you're either on alert, as you discussed, at a go no go. I've heard it called a fail safe point. Well, you have to keep your tanks topped off, or if you're doing a mass scramble, you're expending an enormous amount of fuel for your rapid takeoff and climb out with a full load, and you've got a tank. These are integral and required to the strategic bombing mission.
Yeah, you just couldn't achieve the ranges that you needed to go deep into the Soviet Union. Even forget from the continental United States, even from forward bases in places like the UK and Morocco and Okinawa, you just couldn't get there without air refueling. Mm-hmm. Now, then you had another airplane called the B-36. The B-36 was essentially the last World War II bomber. It was an enormous airplane. It was called the aluminum overcast, or magnesium overcast. It used a lot of magnesium. It had 6 big engines, and later versions added 4 jet engines to supplement the 6 big reciprocating engines. And it did not have aero refueling. It had intercontinental range based purely on its internal fuel. I mean, it was like a flying battleship. And the origins of that airplane were in World War II, when we were concerned that if England fell, we might have to bomb Germany from the continental United States. And so they started to develop this thing during World War II, but it was kind of a back burner effort because it was clear that England wasn't going to fall and we had more immediate needs. But after the war, we continued working on this. It first flew, I believe, in 1946. And then it went into service with Strategic Air Command. B-36 had enormous unrefueled range, and it had a huge payload. I mean, it was the only airplane that was big enough to carry the first generation of thermonuclear weapons. The problem was that it was fundamentally a World War II airplane in terms of its speed and altitude and all that. So it had some specific capabilities that were very valuable, but it was also kind of the end of the line of a previous generation of technology. And in addition, if you have 6 enormous R4360 engines, what's that? That's a few hundred spark plugs you have to change. Just from a maintenance point of view,
right.
It was a nightmare. It was so yes, the last B-36s stayed in service till 1959, but it was clearly yesterday's news. The future was jet propulsion. So remember the big 3 of nuclear weapons, air refueling, and jet propulsion. Now the first Air Force jet bomber, operational jet bomber, was the B-45 Tornado from North American, but that was really a tactical bomber, not a nuclear bomber. It was used also for some reconnaissance missions. The first intercontinental nuclear bomb, or not really intercontinental, intermediate range, it was not intercontinental, was the Boeing B-47. It was used by Strategic Air Command. It was really, I mean, considering it first flew in 1947, and, you're in an era where you're a couple of years later than the B-29, let's say, and this thing was like out of a science fiction movie. It had swept wings, it had jet engines and pods. I like to say that it was arguably the most technologically influential aircraft in history, because if you go out to an airport today, go to your local commercial airport, you're going to see a bunch of airplanes that have swept wings and jet engines on pods underneath the wings, and what you're looking at is essentially the B-47 configuration. The B-47 also was really, because it was a pioneer. I mean, it was, as I said, it was 2 years after it first flew, 2 years after the end of World War II, and it was completely beyond anything of that era. It had a lot of problems. Its engines were first-generation jet engines. They were anemic. Structurally, it had a whole bunch of problems. We hadn't quite figured out how to build airplanes in this environment. The wings sometimes broke off. It had a habit of crashing. It was a very hard airplane to fly, but it was spectacularly more capable than what had come before it. Just for one thing, however, it did not have much range. And because the early engines guzzled. So it was very dependent on aero refueling. And that was also a problem because the B-47 was this early jet and it could fly fast, but it couldn't fly slow. The tanker was the KC-97, which was a straight wing reciprocating engine. So here's what would happen. This jet, which was running out of fuel, would come screaming up to the KC-97, and the KC-97 is straining its engines to go as fast as possible, and meanwhile the B-47 is flying as slow as possible to keep up with the KC-97, and it's just about to fall out of the sky. So the B-47 hooks up with the KC-97. Now, the KC-97, in order to fly fast enough to keep the B-47 from falling out of the air that's hooked up to it, needs to go into a descent. So, as they're refueling, they're descending. And eventually the B-47 fills up with fuel, hooks up. Now it's at low altitude, and all this fuel it just took on, now it needs to burn that fuel to get back up to altitude.
Get back up.
Now, I should mention that my father was a navigator in the 90th Air Refueling Squadron on a KC-97G, so he did this firsthand, as well as the fact that you had this issue of a performance mismatch between the B-47 and the KC-97. You also had an enormous achievement, which is, now you had to be able to navigate globally and have these two airplanes meet up, over the Arctic or something like that. And they did it back then. It was a real achievement. But it was really on the ragged edge of feasibility. So you needed a better tanker, and we'll talk about that in a minute. You needed a tanker that was compatible, but you also needed really a new bomber. The B-47 was a first-generation bomber, and it had first-generation engines. What the B-52, which followed it only by a few years, at first they started developing it in the late 1940s, and it first had its first flight in 1952. First delivery of Strategic Air Command in 1955, and initial operational capability in 1956. The B-52 was much bigger than the B-47. It carried a bigger bomb load. It also had second-generation jet engines, which was the J-57 from Pratt & Whitney. And people talk a lot about how Boeing developed it, but it was really the J-57 engine that was the key to that airplane. Because now you had an airplane with enough efficiency that you could have both jet performance like the B-47 and intercontinental range like the B-36 plus aero refueling, and finally you had the airplane that the Strategic Air Command really wanted. In addition to the B-50, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say one quick aside to sort of emphasize your comment about modern day airliners in the B-47. If you look at the prototype B-52, it had a cockpit layout very reminiscent of a B-47, and you can see the evolution into what we know now. And I just wanted to say as an aside, if anyone wants to see some really interesting contemporary footage of the B-36 and the B-47, there's a Jimmy Stewart movie called Strategic Air Command, which is a very 1950s movie, still entertaining, but the Air Force worked with them. It was, in a way, maybe the filming equivalent of the Top Gun of its day. Some great footage. So I just wanted to put that out to the listeners so you could. The thing that struck me, you mentioned the B-36 being the battleship of the skies, and when I saw the footage of the crew inside, like they're walking around inside this bomber. I mean, it looks almost like a CIC of a ship.
Yeah, no, you got to watch the movie Strategic Air Command. You just have to watch it if you're interested in this period. But with the B-52, now you need a tanker that's suitable for the B-52, and you get the Boeing KC-135, which people say, oh, that's the tanker version of the 707. That's actually not true. It's the tanker cousin of the... it's actually a different airplane, and if you put them next to each other and look at things like fuselage diameter, you realize they're not the same airplane. But there's obviously a family resemblance. They go back to the same prototype, and the KC-135, now you have a jet tanker, it has 4 of the same engines as the B-52 does, and now you have a tanker where the performance is compatible with the bomber. So between, you start looking at the late 1950s, now you have the B-52, you still have B-47s, but you have the last few B-36s, but you see the B-52 taking over. You see the KC-135 starting to replace the KC-97, which of course would not go away till the 1960s, but you had a whole new generation, and now you had a new generation of thermonuclear weapons, and that is America's big punch in the late 50s, early 60s. And as we previously talked about, it was the ultimate deterrent to war, because that combination could have wiped the Soviet Union off the face of the earth, and everybody knew it. So that's where we are. Meanwhile, aviation technology is advancing, and the new frontier in aviation technology is supersonic flight. And if you look at a trend that starts off in World War II with glorified box kites that are going at a few thousand feet and maybe 100 miles an hour, and then you go up to B-17s and B-24s that are going 200 or so miles an hour and flying at 30,000 feet, and then you go to the B-29 that's going 100 miles an hour faster and is the crew is in pressurized comfort at 30,000 feet, and then you go to the jet airplanes that are flying even higher and of course much faster. The next step is let's even go higher and faster. And that seemed to make a lot of sense at the time. So the first supersonic bomber that you see in the United States is the B-58 Hustler. And the B-58 Hustler is from Convair, what would later be called General Dynamics. And it is this Delta Wing 4, afterburning J79 engines. This is amongst the most needle nose. This is about the coolest looking airplane ever built. Mm-hmm. It is gorgeous. It also was not, but it was an airplane had a lot of problems. It was fast and it was beautiful. It also was crash prone. It had short range. It was heavily dependent on air refueling. There was a SAC general who described the airplane as being the ideal weapon if we wanted to go to war with Canada. It had a whole bunch of other deficiencies. It was unreliable. It was expensive to operate and maintain. There was one calculation that a wing of B-58s cost 3 times as much to operate and maintain as a wing of B-52s, considering that it had a much smaller payload and a shorter range. There's still people who are total fanboys of the B-58, and if you just love beautiful airplanes, it's easy to be a fanboy. Strategic Air Command was not a fanboy of the B-58. It first flew in the 1950s. It went into service in 1960, and by 1970 they were all gone. Cool plane, not a very good weapon system. I know that sets the fanboys off, but it's true.
I do love the B-58. It is a polished metal B-58 with that black anti-glare nose. There are few things sexier in the air to look at, but you're right.
You can't not love the B-58. I mean, you if you're listening to this podcast and you don't love the B-58, I don't know why you're listening to this podcast. Yeah. It just wasn't a very effective weapon system. It was a terrible weapon system. Now, the B-58 was a short-range airplane. It was kind of a replacement for the B-47, although not really, as we said. But the question was, what would replace the B-52? And arguably, the story of the B-1, which is why we're here, is a story of how do we replace the B-52. So in 1954, the Air Force started to sit down and say, what are we going to do to replace the B-52? Now, you got to understand that in 1954, the B-52 was still only in flight test status. There had never been a B-52 delivered to the Air Force. It certainly wasn't operational, but technology was moving so fast at this time that the Air Force was already said, well, we'll have the B-52. It'll be around for 5 to 10 years, and then we're going to have something better. In 2023, that sounds ridiculous because we still have the B-52, but that did not sound ridiculous back then. The B-52 was almost, yes, it was the bomber that SAC really wanted, but it was also regarded as just the next step. And so the Air Force sat down and started thinking about what would replace the B-52. And they came up with three concepts. The first was the intercontinental ballistic missile. So we've already talked about how that came about, but that was one idea. The second idea was we were going to build a huge intercontinental bomber that could go Mach 3. Now, you have to understand how ambitious this was. In 1954, and they weren't quite set on Mach 3 yet, but the only experimental rocket planes at Edwards had ever gone Mach 2. The first airplane to go Mach 3, which would also be an experimental rocket plane, that was still a couple of years away, and they're already thinking about Mach 2 or Mach 3 bombers. So incredibly ambitious. And then the third idea, if that wasn't ambitious enough for you, the third idea was even more outrageous. It was a nuclear-powered bomber, not nuclear-armed bomber, but nuclear-powered bomber. In theory, it would have infinite range. I mean, yeah, at some point, I guess the engines would run out of oil, and in some cases, in some way, the crew would probably run out of food, and the commodes would get filled. But you would have a bomber with essentially infinite range. Now, the Air Force and industry and the Atomic Energy Commission actually worked on nuclear power aerial propulsion into the early 1960s. And bluntly, it was one of the craziest ideas that's ever been pursued because there were a couple minor details. If one of these things crashed, I mean, you would have the environmental catastrophe of all time. Airplanes do occasionally crash. Mm-hmm. Also, there was the minor detail of how would you maintain this airplane? I mean, this thing would be radioactively hot around the engines. So how are you going to maintain this thing? But this was an era where there was incredible enthusiasm about advanced flight and about nuclear power. And so they worked on this crazy idea and spent a lot of money on it. Needless to say, didn't get anywhere. But let's go back to the supersonic bomber. The Air Force decided they wanted an airplane that would go Mach 3. Which was really beyond the state of the art at the time, because the only airplane that had gone Mach 3 was this rocket-powered X-2 out of Edwards Air Force Base, which was air-launched, screamed to Mach 3, and proceeded to spin out of control and crash. But they got their industry partners working on these things, and they came back with some crazy ideas, and the Air Force said, no, that's not going to work. And then they said, go back and try again. And they came back ideas which were slightly less crazy. Boeing had a really interesting design for this super sleek airplane, and North American Aviation had another super cool design. And these were, I mean, the airplane that was eventually selected was the North American airplane, which became the B-70. And it had General Electric engines, the J93. And I think it's pretty clear to say that this is the coolest looking, most exotic airplane that's ever been built. I mean, this is an airplane whose design goes back to the mid to late 1950s, and if anyone came up with this airplane today, you would go, that's crazy. This thing is too exotic, pushing it too far. And this is what we were working on 65 years ago. The airplane was designed for Mach 3. It had a weight of 600,000 pounds, maximum gross takeoff weight. Just by comparison, a B-52, the early model B-52s were about 450,000 pounds. The late models were 488,000 pounds. So this thing was huge. It was pushing the technology in every which way. You know, at Mach 3, you can't build an airplane out of aluminum anymore because aluminum's going to melt. And this thing, so the ideal material would be titanium, but there wasn't enough titanium in existence to build a fleet of 600,000-pound bombers, so they were going to build the thing out of stainless steel, honeycomb. I mean, this thing was off the wall. And the Air Force was totally committed to this thing. The problem is that the Eisenhower administration was not totally committed to this thing. Dwight Eisenhower was very much a fiscal conservative. And he had given us this warning about the military-industrial complex and everything. And while the Air Force was totally committed to the B-70, Eisenhower said, well, we'll build a couple and see what this thing's about, because it's not clear to me, the triad actually didn't, as a concept, didn't exist in the late 1950s yet. And yeah, we'll play around with this, but we might well be into the age of missiles. And it's not clear that we need bombers, let alone what is going to be an exorbitantly expensive B-70. But in the end, the Air Force built, and the skepticism on the B-70 continued into the Kennedy administration. Robert S. McNamara, the very powerful and influential Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, was not a fan of the B-70 either. The Air Force kept pushing it in various variants of it, and they, in the end, they built two prototypes, the XB-70As. These were not really bombers. They didn't have any mission equipment. They didn't have bombing and navigation systems. They never delivered weapons or anything like that. They were pure aerodynamics and propulsion demonstrators. In the end, they were as much used as for research into high-speed flight, particularly looking forward to supersonic transports, which were regarded as the next thing in civilian aviation, as they were bombers of the future. It was pretty clear by the early 1960s that no way was this going to be the bomber of the future. And we'll actually talk about, why it wasn't the bomber of the future as we move into future episodes. But the B-70 wasn't it. In fact, the next Air Force strategic bomber was a much different kind of airplane. The B-52 continued, and it was supplemented by an airplane called the FB-111. The F-111 was a very advanced tactical fighter program. It was McNamara's true love, because McNamara believed that there was a lot of wasteful duplication between the services. So why don't we just build one kind of fighter airplane and let all the services use it? That turned out to actually, in hindsight, to be a very bad idea, which we then proceeded to repeat with the F-35, which is, of course, a different subject that we'll talk about some other time. It's worked out much better with the F-35 for a variety of reasons. But nonetheless, there was the F-111A for the Air Force, which was primarily a fighter bomber to deliver weapons. And there was the F-111B for the Navy, which was for fleet air defense. Now, the third version of the F-111 would be called the FB-111A, and it was essentially a medium strategic bomber for the Strategic Air Command, and that was intended to replace the early B-52s and also the B-58. The FB-111A had some really good characteristics. I mean, if you want an airplane that could fly low and fast, and as we'll get into in the next discussion, low made a lot more sense than high, actually. If you want an airplane that could fly low and fast in terrain-following flight, the FB-111 was great. It also could deliver weapons very accurately. The problem was that it was just a little airplane. I mean, it was basically a modified fighter. And so it was somewhat short range. You had to base them in the northern United States. They were based in Plattsburgh, New York, eventually, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And so fairly close to the Soviet Union. You couldn't go deep into the Soviet Union, and they were heavily dependent on tankers. And they didn't carry very many weapons. But, of course, with nuclear weapons, that's to some extent less of a factor. So it was an airplane of limited capabilities, but it had the advantage of being a derivative of McNamara's beloved F-111. And so that became actually SAC's next bomber to supplement the B-52.
Right. Just looking back at those last two and the dichotomy between them, right? And we'll get into it, as you said, in a later episode, the Mach 3 high-altitude B-70 and the supersonic low-altitude FB-111, one an enormous aircraft, one a relatively small aircraft. And neither one really was what was needed to replace the B-52, which was the mainstay. Quick side note, the B-70 program sort of had a tragic coda to its ending with a midair collision during a photo op. But if you go look at the B-70 photos, even in the air, you get a feel for what a big plane it was. But go search out some photos of it on the ground with other aircraft. And I'm not sure if it was an air show or a technology demonstrator day, but just seeing it around other aircraft really gives you the idea of how much of the envelope they were trying to press with this thing.
Better yet, go to the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio.
Excellent.
And look at the surviving airplane and be stunned and drool for hours as you walk around it. It is an incredible machine. Not a very good concept for a bomber, but an incredible machine.
Right. So, with that said, what have we talked about today? Well, in little more than 50 years, the ideas of strategic bombing went from, as you said, glorified box kites to full-blown triad of nuclear deterrence, right? And it's in that scenario that the United States then finds itself. It believes the B-52 is a 5 to 10-year program, and we're already delving into that, and its successors. One is I won't say a failure, but it's not going to come to fruition in the B-70. The B-58 and the follow-on FB-111 are not going to fill the role, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode, right, Ken?
Indeed. Now, what's interesting is that the whole series that we're doing is the Supersonic Bone. It's about the B-1. We've spent now the better part of 2 hours discussing, and we haven't mentioned the B-1 at all. But what we have done is provide a historical context into which the B-1 will appear. And that's very important because you can't understand why the B-1 was developed and why it looks like what it does and can do what it does unless you understand that context.
Absolutely. I think you've done an excellent job of guiding the listener through that history so that we really understand, and giving a little bit of a preview or a spoiler of the next episode. It's that context that makes some of the decisions in the 70s so surprising, and the lack of that context that maybe led to those decisions. But that's a story for another time, and that other time is going to be the next episode, where we're going to tell you all about the start of the B-1 program, the need to transition to low-level penetration as a mission parameter, cruise missiles and how those, specifically air-launched cruise missiles, and how those fit into this. And we'll start to talk about how the Soviets responded to these threats. So, Ken, any final words for today's episode?
Well, stay tuned, because very interesting developments are going to be talked about coming up.
Yeah, and if you haven't already, go pick up the Supersonic Bone by Ken Katz and read along with us. Ken, where can people find it?
The book is available if you're in... First of all, the book is published by Pen and Sword, which is a UK-based publisher. So if you're in the UK or Europe, you can buy it directly from Pen and Sword. The US distributor is Casamate, and you can buy it from their website. You also can get it online in all the usual retail channels like Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
And it also is out in an ebook format.
Yes.
So I would recommend, if you can find the hard copy, as Ken said, the photos in it are phenomenal and really just let you see the beauty of the B-1, but we'll save that for the next episode. So, looking forward to talking to everybody. Ken, thank you for your time. Thanks for listening to the Supersonic Bone on Authentic. Join us next time when Ken and Roger talk about the design, development, test, and eventual cancellation of the original B-1A design. We at Authentic appreciate your subscribing to our channel. If you'd like to help us bring more content and grow the channel, leave a rating and a review on your listening platform of choice and tell a friend. Thanks for listening.